He emptied their trash and mopped their floors. But when they told him to leave graduation, everything stopped. No one in Ridgepoint High School's gymnasium was thinking about the janitor that day. Not at first. Under a sky so blue it almost seemed to hum, families filed into the air-conditioned expanse of the gym, their chatter rising above the squeak of folding chairs and the distant pop of camera flashes. Students in navy blue caps and gowns huddled near the stage, sneakers peeking out under heavy robes, nerves tangled with excitement. Above them, banners in school colors, gold and indigo, hung from the rafters, catching stray sunlight that snuck through the high windows. Charlotte, North Carolina. It was graduation day, and the world outside seemed to hush in respect for this moment, but inside the atmosphere buzzed. Parents jockeyed for the best view. A grandmother dabbed tears from her cheeks, smiling between sniffles. Teachers, wearing their own ceremonial robes, lined up near the stage, glancing at clipboards and nodding to each other in silent agreement. Today was for the kids. Near the back, blending into the shadows cast by the gym's massive support beams, stood Eddie Harmon. He was easy to miss, just a man in a faded green work jacket and an old, sweat-darkened navy cap that sat low on his brow. His movements were gentle, almost invisible. Hands folded around the handle of a battered broom, gaze wandering quietly over the assembled families. If anyone looked his way, they saw only another janitor. A fixture, a piece of the background, nothing worth remembering. But Eddie Harmon was there for something more important than any mess. This was his granddaughter's day. Aaliyah, sharp-eyed and sharp-witted, was not only graduating, but she'd earned the title of valedictorian, the first in their family to do so. Weeks earlier, she'd pressed a handwritten invitation into his palm. "You better sit up front with us, Grandpa," she'd said, her tone half joking, half serious. "Promise me," he'd smiled, slow and small. "I'll be there, honey," he replied, voice rough with age and something deeper. "But you know me, I'll keep out of the way. This is your moment." So now, as the school gym filled with anticipation, Eddie watched from his chosen spot in the back, near the emergency exit. From here, he could see everything, the proud swell of families, the nervous cluster of teachers, and most of all, Aaliyah, standing at the edge of the stage with her classmates. Her hair was styled simply, her expression pure steel and starlight. For a moment, Eddie let himself believe he was invisible, just another ghost in the machine of this school, watching his family's dreams unfold. But you can never really hide, not in a room full of people who don't know your story. Across the gym, a teacher named Mrs. Dunham paused mid-conversation. She noticed Eddie, standing awkwardly behind the last row of folding chairs, his broom pressed like a staff at his side. She frowned, glancing at the security guard by the doors. "Isn't he supposed to be out in the hallway?" she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "During the ceremony?" The security guard, Mr. Price, a well-meaning but by-the-book man, nodded and started across the gym floor. He motioned to another staff member, Miss Carter, and together they made their way toward Eddie, weaving through knots of chatting parents and fidgeting graduates. Eddie saw them coming before they spoke, but he didn't move. He straightened quietly, resting both hands on the handle of his broom. He knew this routine. All his life, he'd been careful not to make scenes. "Sir," Mr. Price began, his voice polite but practiced. "This section is for guests only. We'll need you to wait outside until after the ceremony." Eddie met his gaze, dark eyes calm beneath the rim of his cap. "I'm just here to watch my granddaughter graduate," he said quietly. "I'll stay out of the way. Won't cause no trouble." Miss Carter tried to soften things, forcing a smile. "We understand, but this really isn't appropriate attire for the ceremony. The principal's very particular about the image today. It's, well, you know." Eddie's shoulders dipped, ever so slightly. He didn't argue. The room around him began to shift. Several students in the back row snickered, and one parent leaned over to whisper, lips curled with something between annoyance and pity. Eddie glanced at the floor, the old tile scuffed from decades of basketball games and winter dances. For a heartbeat, he considered leaving, just slipping out before anyone noticed. He remembered his promise to Aaliyah. His hands tightened on the broom, but the pressure from the staff was subtle and persistent. "Come on, sir," Mr. Price said again, a little more firmly. "Let's not cause a scene on a special day." A hush seemed to creep up from the back rows, rippling outward. Eddie stepped back, the hurt in his eyes too quiet for most to see, but for a few seconds it seemed as if every stray laugh and sidelong glance was a spotlight. Outside, birds sang in the trees lining the parking lot, oblivious to the small storm brewing inside. Eddie shuffled toward the door, each step weighted with a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, unseen except by those who loved him. He never once looked up, not until the unmistakable sound of dress shoes on hardwood echoed from the second row, a new presence rising in the stillness, bringing everything and everyone to a sudden and unplanned halt. The energy in the gym shifted, slowly at first, like a subtle change in air pressure before a storm. Eddie Harmon could feel it, though he kept his eyes down, willing himself invisible. The ache in his chest deepened, not from age or injury, but from something harder to shake, a lifetime of being reminded where he stood. But on this day, in this room crowded with celebration, fate had something different in store. Just as Eddie's hand brushed the cool metal of the exit door, the sound of movement caught his attention. It wasn't the shuffle of impatient parents or the restless cough of a bored teacher. No, this was measured, deliberate, a pair of shoes that struck the gym floor with a crisp, unhurried certainty of a man used to commanding respect. And then another set of footsteps followed, lighter but still purposeful, echoing just behind. Eddie hesitated, still facing the door. The staff paused too, thrown off by the interruption. Heads turned as a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp army dress uniform stepped out from the second row, his ribbons and medals flashing in the light like tiny, silent trumpets. He was accompanied by a teenage boy, 15, maybe 16, also in full military dress, posture ramrod straight, face set in an expression of fierce pride. The room grew quieter, as if a hand had gently pressed pause on the day's celebration. Families shifted in their seats. Some teachers straightened unconsciously, drawn by the magnetism of authority and the quiet gravity that only a soldier carries. The man's eyes, a sharp shade of gray, swept over the crowd, landing unerringly on Eddie. With a steady, confident stride, he approached, his presence commanding without arrogance. As he neared the small tableau by the exit, the crowd's curiosity turned to murmurs. Questions flickered from ear to ear. Who was this? Why was he approaching the janitor? Mr. Price and Miss Carter stepped back, both suddenly aware they were out of their depth. The soldier stopped just a few feet from Eddie and offered a slight nod, not of pity, but of genuine recognition. He pointed to Eddie's cap, a battered navy blue piece of cloth, nearly as old as the man who wore it. "That's Master Sergeant Eddie Harmon," the soldier announced, voice steady, but carrying effortlessly across the gym. "He pulled my brother from a burning vehicle in Iraq. 91. He's a decorated war hero. You don't escort someone like that out of any room." His words hit the crowd like a spark in dry grass. Whispers ignited. "He's military? Wait, the janitor? Are you sure?" Eddie blinked, his surprise only betrayed by a quick, uncertain glance. He hadn't heard that name, that rank, in years, not spoken aloud in a place like this, in front of people who thought they knew everything they needed to know about the man with the broom. Mr. Price's face flushed crimson. Miss Carter looked as if she wanted to melt through the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. The principal, Mr. Jennings, paused mid-sentence on stage. The speech in his hand forgotten as the ripples of realization reached the platform. Even the students at the edge of the crowd, those who'd giggled just minutes before, now sat up, eyes wide, craning for a better view. The soldier, Colonel David Ross, as many soon recalled, turned his attention to the staff. He didn't ask for recognition, but if you know the stories he's lived, you know he's more than earned his place in any seat in this gym. a weight fell away from Eddie's shoulders. He didn't straighten with pride or puff up his chest. Instead, he stood a little taller, as if remembering how to breathe again. His eyes glistened not from sadness, but from a cocktail of shock, gratitude, and humility that words could never describe. The gym was silent except for the soft whir of ceiling fans. For the first time, the crowd truly saw him, not as a janitor, but as someone whose story was written in sacrifice and service, whose quiet presence hid years of courage. Aaliyah, standing at the front of the stage, had seen her grandfather's slow retreat, had watched the drama unfold. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The microphone at the podium picked up the faint hitch in her breath. As she stepped forward, leaving her place among the rows of shining graduates. But before she could reach him, the attention stayed fixed on Eddie and the man who had recognized him. Colonel Ross addressed the room, his son standing proudly at his side. My brother is alive today because of this man, the colonel continued, his voice never rising, never pleading, just the plain, hard truth. Back then, he didn't hesitate. He risked his life, and then he disappeared back into the ranks, never asked for thanks, never wanted glory. Eddie swallowed, his gaze shifting to the floor. He felt the weight of every eye, every hushed voice, and it was almost too much. A single trembling hand rose from the back. An older woman, eyes bright with tears. Oh, I remember you, she called softly. You cleaned my classroom for years. You always left a little flower on my desk after my husband passed. The crowd's perception continued to shift. He wasn't just a janitor, not just a war hero. He was a fixture in their lives, a silent guardian, a source of kindness in a world that moved too fast to notice. Mr. Jennings finally found his voice, stepping to the edge of the stage. Mr. Harmon, he called, the microphone lending a tremor to his words. On behalf of Ridgepoint High, please accept our apologies. You are welcome here, and you always will be. Eddie nodded once, unable to speak. The staff stepped back, retreating to the edge of the gym, faces red with embarrassment. For a long, fragile moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, from the center of the gym, applause began. Soft, tentative, but quickly swelling. Families rose to their feet, joined by teachers and students, until the entire gym thundered with a standing ovation that washed over Eddie like a tide. He looked up at last, meeting the eyes of his granddaughter. Aaliyah smiled, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Eddie realized something he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes, the greatest battles are fought in silence, and the truest recognition is found in the eyes of those who finally see you. The applause still echoed, folding into the high corners of Ridgepoint High's gymnasium, a swelling tidal wave of recognition that seemed to surprise even those clapping. In the middle of it all, Eddie Harmon stood, broom in hand, as though he'd been rooted to the floor by years of silent service and stubborn humility. Every instinct told him to shrink back, to let the crowd's attention settle on anyone else. But as the ovation lingered, something inside him eased. He'd spent a lifetime unnoticed. Now, if only for a minute, he let himself be seen. On stage, Principal Jennings struggled to regain composure. He'd lost his place in the speech, the carefully scripted lines about hard work and perseverance, suddenly hollow compared to what had just unfolded. He cleared his throat, still watching Eddie from the corner of his eye, and decided, with a rare flash of humility, to step aside. Today, the story didn't belong to him. In the front rows, Aaliyah's family sat in stunned silence, eyes wide, jaws slack. Her mother, clutching a bouquet of white lilies, turned to her husband, her expression a mix of pride and disbelief. "Did you know about many of this?" she whispered, but he only shook his head, too moved for words. Aaliyah herself barely registered the applause. Her focus was entirely on Eddie. For years, he'd been the quiet force behind her every milestone, sneaking into parent-teacher conferences when her mom had to work, cheering the loudest from the farthest bleachers at her track meets, slipping her notes of encouragement on the mornings she dreaded. She remembered how he'd tie his work boots with steady hands, rise before dawn, and return home exhausted but always smiling if she'd had a good day. But she'd never known the full story. She'd heard rumors, sure, stories of the Navy, bits and pieces of military lore that her grandfather always waved off with a gentle laugh. That was another lifetime, he'd say. Now, that lifetime had caught up to him, refusing to let him fade into the background any longer. As the applause waned, Colonel Ross moved to Eddie's side, a respectful distance but with unmistakable solidarity. The teenage son remained at attention, chest proud, eyes never leaving Eddie's face. Colonel Ross extended his hand. "I can never thank you enough, Master Sergeant Harmon," he said, his voice low but steady. "My brother's kids gotta grow up with a father because of you. That kind of debt, there's no paying it back." Eddie accepted the handshake, his grip firm despite the tremor in his hands. "We did what we had to do," he replied softly. "That's all any of us can say." Around them, people began to whisper in earnest. Word of what had happened traveled faster than wildfire. Students checking their phones, texting friends, searching for scraps of Eddie's story online. A few began to recall little moments, a door held open, a lost phone returned, a kind word on a bad day. The gym that had once felt cavernous now seemed intimate, bound together by the realization that the man they'd overlooked was, in truth, the foundation beneath their feet. Back near the stage, the senior class advisor, Ms. Patel, a sharp-eyed woman known for her tough love, stepped up to the microphone. She cleared her throat, gathering the room's attention. "If I may," she began, her tone softer than usual, "I think today we've all learned something about what it means to serve. Not just in uniform, but every day, quietly, without fanfare." She turned to Eddie, offering a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Harmon, for everything." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Even some of the teachers, who'd spent years walking past Eddie in the halls, now found themselves blinking back tears. It was as if the act of seeing him anew had cast a spell, one that revealed the hidden threads of kindness and sacrifice that held their community together. Aaliyah couldn't wait any longer. Without waiting for permission, she slipped down from the stage and crossed the floor, her gown trailing behind her. The sea of faces parted, the crowd instinctively making room. She reached Eddie, and for a second the world shrank to just the two of them. She threw her arms around him, holding tight. "Grandpa," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You didn't tell me." He squeezed her back, words failing him. For the first time in years, his hands shook not from exhaustion or age, but from the overwhelming force of pride and love. The crowd watched, some openly wiping tears, as Aaliyah turned toward the stage, eyes bright with resolve. As she moved to the microphone, her grip steady despite her trembling hands. "That man right there is my grandfather," she announced, her voice carrying with the weight of truth. "He's the reason I made it to this stage. He's not just a janitor, he's my foundation." For a heartbeat, the gym was silent. Then, as if on cue, dozens of voices rose in stunned awe. The gravity of her words settled over the crowd. The students, who had moments before been whispering and giggling, now looked at Eddie with a new respect, their own struggles feeling smaller in comparison. Aaliyah's eyes swept the room, meeting gaze after gaze. "We spend so much time looking past the people who hold us up," she continued, "but sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's given us the most." Eddie listened, heart pounding. It was as if all the moments he'd spent in silence, all the times he'd chosen not to tell his story, were being rewritten, not by him, but by the granddaughter he'd raised to be brave, thoughtful, and unafraid to speak truth to power. On the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Dunham, the teacher who'd first questioned Eddie's presence, dabbed her eyes. She remembered now how Eddie had once comforted her son after a rough day, how he'd kept her late husband's old classroom spotless out of respect. Across the gym, a parent who'd shaken his head at Eddie's attire now stood, hands clapping, a look of regret and admiration on his face. Aaliyah ended her speech simply, her voice shaking with emotion, but crystal clear. Today, I stand on this stage, not just for myself, but for every person like my grandfather, whose strength, love, and sacrifice make our dreams possible. The crowd erupted again, louder than before. It wasn't just applause now. It was gratitude, awe, and a shared sense of humility. Eddie closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He'd never asked for this. Never imagined his story would matter to anyone but his family. But today, in this gym full of lives he'd quietly touched, he knew he belonged. Not as a janitor, not even as a war hero, but as a man who had finally, at long last, been seen. As the echoes of applause faded and the crowd slowly sat down, Ridgepoint High School's gymnasium hung in a rare, reverent silence. It was the kind of stillness that follows a revelation, where the ordinary transforms into the unforgettable, and everyone in the room feels, if only for a moment, profoundly changed. Aaliyah stepped from the microphone, cheeks damp with tears, and returned to her grandfather's side. Eddie, still trembling from the storm of emotions, looked around the vast gym as if seeing it for the first time. All the familiar faces, parents, teachers, even the school's football coach, who'd never once addressed him by name, were now trained on him, their expressions softened with regret, respect, and newfound understanding. Colonel Ross remained close, his son beside him, both standing at attention as if they were on parade grounds rather than hardwood floors. Colonel Ross gave a respectful nod to Eddie, a silent affirmation passed between veterans. Eddie acknowledged it with a faint, humble smile, memories of comrades long gone flickering across his weathered features. Mr. Price and Miss Carter, the staff members who had asked Eddie to leave, now found themselves shrinking in the crowd, faces flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Price, usually so sure of the boundaries that kept his world tidy, stared down at his shoes, his authority replaced with a gnawing sense of shame. Miss Carter kept wringing her hands, haunted by the way she'd spoken to the man who, for years, had quietly righted all the little wrongs the rest of the staff overlooked. The principal, Mr. Jennings, realizing the need for both humility and leadership, stepped forward. He took the microphone with unsteady hands, his prepared notes useless now, and cleared his throat. Today, Mr. Jennings began, we have all been reminded of something far greater than any diploma or honor roll. We have learned the power of presence, how a single life, lived in quiet service and sacrifice, can hold up an entire community without most of us even realizing it. He glanced at Eddie, his voice thick. Mr. Armin, Ridgepoint High owes you an apology, and so much more. You have served not just your country, but this very building, these students, and our families. Today, you remind us of what it truly means to lead with humility, integrity, and heart. A ripple of agreement swept the room. Teachers and students nodded, some dabbing at their eyes. Mr. Jennings paused, searching for the right words, then added, if you would do us the honor, we would like you to remain for the ceremony, not as a janitor, but as our guest. Eddie nodded silently. The weight of so many years of being unnoticed, unseen, unthanked, seemed to slip from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter and unfamiliar. Pride, yes. Relief, maybe. But also an uneasy hope that perhaps just this once, the world would remember the quiet ones. As the principal stepped away, the focus of the gym shifted again. Aaliyah reached for her grandfather's hand, squeezing it tightly. He looked at her, his eyes shining, and smiled a smile she would never forget. The ceremony continued, but everything felt different. When the band played Pomp and Circumstance, it was as though the music itself had grown richer, heavier with meaning. Each graduate who crossed the stage did so with a sense of greater gratitude. Even those who'd never spoken a word to Eddie seemed to carry themselves taller, as if a lesson had settled deep in their bones. Several teachers exchanged quiet glances, the gravity of what they'd almost allowed to happen sinking in. Miss Patel, the senior class advisor, found herself recalling all the mornings Eddie had set up the gym, for school assemblies, sometimes arriving before sunrise so the chairs would be perfectly aligned. She'd never thought to thank him, not really, not until today. In the crowd, the retired veterans in attendance straightened their backs a bit more, their eyes moist, some saluting quietly in Eddie's direction. Parents, especially those who'd come from humble backgrounds themselves, felt an ache of recognition. They whispered to their children, "See that man? He's a real hero." Meanwhile, word spread beyond the gym walls. Several students discreetly pulled out their phones, live streaming or texting friends. "You won't believe what just happened at graduation. The janitor's a war hero. People tried to kick him out, and then..." The story was already escaping Ridgepoint's boundaries, destined for social media, for family dinners, for the local news. But inside, the moment belonged only to those present. As the ceremony neared its end, the principal announced Aaliyah as valedictorian. She rose, every eye on her, and crossed the stage not just as the school's top student, but as the granddaughter of the man everyone now wanted to know. She stood at the podium, her hands steady on the sides, and began her speech. The words she'd prepared, the ones about perseverance, community, and dreams, now carried a sharper edge, their meaning deepened by the events of the afternoon. "My grandfather," she said, her voice unwavering, "taught me that real success isn't measured by trophies or titles. It's measured by the lives we touch, the sacrifices we make, and the courage we show. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in the shadows. I stand here because he never let me give up, never let me believe I was alone." She paused, searching the audience until she found Eddie's gaze. "He always told me, no job is too small if it lets you help someone else. Today, I finally understand what he meant." The crowd listened, rapt. Some students had never seen Aaliyah speak with such passion. Others found themselves inspired in ways they couldn't explain. Parents gripped their children's hands, sensing that something profound was unfolding. She ended with a simple request. "Let's promise not to let anyone's kindness go unseen. Let's be the generation that notices the quiet heroes among us." As she left the stage, a standing ovation followed her, one that belonged to her, but even more so to Eddie. In the front row, Colonel Ross wiped his eyes, his son looking up at him with admiration. "Dad," the boy whispered, "I want to be like him one day." "You will," the colonel replied, "but only if you remember that being a hero isn't about medals or ceremonies. It's about how you treat people. Every day, no matter who's watching." The gym lights shone brighter somehow, reflecting off banners and faces alike. Eddie, seated at last among his family, watched his granddaughter accept her diploma, his heart fuller than it had ever been. He was still the janitor, still the man with the broom, but now, finally, everyone knew what that truly meant. As Aaliyah left the stage, the gym remained caught in a warm current of applause that seemed to last longer than anyone expected. Pride radiated from her every step. She rejoined her family, where Eddie sat at her mother's insistence. This time, not in the shadows, but front and center, he clung to his granddaughter's hand, both of them trembling in a way that only comes when years of quiet sacrifice finally meet the sunlight. While the rest of the students filed across the stage to receive their diplomas, something had shifted in the air. Where there had once been routine and tradition, there was now an electric anticipation, an unspoken hope that maybe, before the ceremony ended, someone would do what was right for Eddie. In the crowd, a group of veterans began to gather quietly near the side aisle, forming a small cluster in their faded jackets and old campaign caps. Some were from the VFW post on the other side of town. A few wore Ridgepoint High colors, having worked here as groundskeepers, bus drivers, or cafeteria staff after their own years of service. They watched Eddie, their faces lined with both admiration and the shared knowledge that respect, once lost, is hard won back. Backstage, Principal Jennings wiped his brow, torn between relief that the crisis had passed and anxiety over what more might happen before the day was done. He'd already fielded whispers from the superintendent and several board members who'd heard about the incident, some through teachers, others via social media posts that were already getting attention. He knew what he had to do, and this day would not end with Eddie's story half told. As the last graduate left the stage, Mr. Jennings returned to the microphone, tapping it gently until the buzz in the gym softened. He cleared his throat, this time with new resolve. Before we close today's ceremony, I'd like to recognize one more person, a member of our community whose dedication and quiet courage have inspired us all. Master Sergeant Eddie Harmon, would you join me on stage? There was a sudden collective intake of breath. Eddie's eyes widened. He looked at Aaliyah, who smiled, urging him forward. "Go, Grandpa," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes again. "This is your moment." For a moment, Eddie hesitated, unused to the spotlight and the weight of so many eyes. He set his broom aside, running a thumb across the battered navy cap on his head, as if drawing strength from every mile and memory it had seen. Then, with his back straighter than it had been in years, he walked toward the stage, his slow, measured steps echoing in the silent gym. As he climbed the steps, applause began to build. This time, there was nothing perfunctory about it. It was a roar of genuine appreciation, the sort of gratitude that could not be faked or forced. He saw familiar faces, students he'd quietly encouraged, teachers he'd helped without thanks, the football coach who now nodded at him with real respect. He saw Miss Carter, her eyes shining with regret and apology, and Mr. Price, who mouthed a silent, "I'm sorry." Standing beside Principal Jennings, Eddie tried to steady himself. His knees ached and his heart pounded, but his voice was steady when the principal handed him the microphone. Eddie's gaze swept the room. "I've never been much for speeches," he began, his deep, unhurried voice filling the gym. "Most days, I'm happy just to do my job, go home, and see my family. I started working here because I needed to provide, but I stayed because of the people, because of all of you." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the old cap. "I wore this in the Navy for a lot of years. It means something to me, but what means even more is seeing my granddaughter stand up there, proud and strong. I may have helped keep these halls clean, but she's the one who showed me how far love and kindness can go." The gym was utterly silent. Even the restless students, who'd once been eager for the day to end, now leaned forward, listening to every word. Eddie cleared his throat, struggling for a moment with emotion. It doesn't matter what uniform you wear, whether it's a janitor's jacket, a teacher's robe, or a soldier's stripes. What matters is how you treat people. Every day, you get the chance to be good to someone. You get to choose what kind of person you're going to be. He locked eyes with Aaliyah. "I hope you'll all remember that. Don't let the world tell you what you're worth. Sometimes the greatest things you do, no one will ever see. But that's okay. The people who matter will know." When he finished, there was a moment where no one breathed. Then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted in applause, cheering, standing, clapping until hands were sore and voices were hoarse. Several students even began chanting his name. "Mr. Harmon! Mr. Harmon!" Others waved small American flags that had been handed out for the occasion. Principal Jennings put a hand on Eddie's shoulder. "Thank you, sir, for your service here and for your service to our country." Just then, Colonel Ross stepped up, holding a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a gleaming military challenge coin, engraved with the words, "For the quiet who walk with giants." The colonel held the coin out to Eddie. "In the Army, and all branches of the military, we give challenge coins to those who go above and beyond. This one's for you, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Eddie accepted the coin, turning it over in his palm, overwhelmed. "Thank you, Colonel. This means more than I can say." Colonel Ross offered a crisp salute, and after a beat, Eddie returned it with steady precision. The gym erupted once more in cheers. Aaliyah ran onto the stage, throwing her arms around her grandfather as the school band played a triumphant, unscripted tune. Teachers, staff, and students crowded near the front, wanting to shake Eddie's hand, to thank him, to apologize for the years they'd failed to notice his greatness, all the years of being invisible, of being just the janitor, melted away in the shared glow of admiration and respect. Eddie realized then that sometimes it takes just one moment, one act of recognition, to transform a life, and perhaps a whole community. As the crowd celebrated, phones captured the moment, flashes popping like fireworks. For the first time, Eddie smiled and let the world see it. A smile that spoke of sacrifice, humility, and the quiet, enduring strength that real heroes carry. And so, beneath the banners of Ridgepoint High, with family at his side and a community finally seeing him for who he was, Eddie Harmon stood tall, not just as a janitor or a war hero, but as the heart of Ridgepoint's story. Even as the ceremony's formalities faded and students in blue and gold began to mingle and pose for photographs, the aftershocks of Eddie Harmon's recognition continued to ripple through the gym. Every cluster of families seemed to circle back to the moment when the invisible janitor became the day's most important guest, and the story spread outward, family by family, text by text, a chain reaction of respect and regret. Aaliyah remained at Eddie's side as well-wishers queued to shake his hand. She could see how exhausted he was, how each new face brought fresh gratitude and, sometimes, apologies. Miss Carter approached, shoulders squared but her eyes downcast, and waited her turn. When she finally faced Eddie, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Harmon. I should have known better. She hesitated, searching his face for anger or blame. Eddie offered a gentle smile, his tone as warm as ever. "No harm done, ma'am. We all have our days. What matters is what you do next." The simplicity of his forgiveness stung more than any rebuke. Miss Carter nodded, eyes brimming with tears, and moved away to give someone else a turn. Mr. Price followed, even more awkward, tugging at the collar of his uniform. I owe you an apology, too. I let rules get in the way of decency." Eddie patted his shoulder. "You were just doing your job. Now you know a little more. That's how we grow." That was the lesson Eddie had carried through war zones and midnight shifts, the idea that a single act of understanding could change everything. The mood in the gym changed once more as the military veterans gathered near the front row. One by one, they approached Eddie, some with a salute, some with an embrace. Each had a story to share, a tale of service, a memory from a different war, or a simple thank you for being seen. The VFW commander, a wiry man with sharp eyes, presented Eddie with a Ridgepoint challenge coin of his own, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of the town's gratitude. A local news reporter drawn by social media buzz arrived with a camera crew. She approached with the caution of someone who knew she was treading on sacred ground. "Mr. Harmon, would you be willing to share a few words with our viewers?" she asked, her tone reverent. Eddie glanced at Aaliyah. She nodded, giving him silent permission, and he agreed. Under the bright lights, Eddie spoke not of medals or battles, but of family and kindness. "I just wanted to see my granddaughter graduate. I never expected all this. But maybe it's good. Maybe now folks will remember that the people who sweep your floors, serve your meals, or drive your kids to school, they're worth noticing." The reporter thanked him and promised his story would air that night, a reminder to the wider world that dignity is often hidden in plain sight. As the interviews wrapped up, Colonel Ross and his son joined Eddie again. The colonel's gaze was full of admiration, but also a kind of wistful envy. "You know, Master Sergeant, I spent my life chasing medals. I always thought that was how you measured a man. But today, you taught all of us. There's more to being a hero than what you wear on your chest." Eddie chuckled, eyes crinkling. Medals are nice, but it's what you carry in your heart that counts." The colonel's son, a boy on the edge of manhood, his uniform still crisp, stared at Eddie as if seeing his own future reflected back. "Sir, did you ever think people would remember you like this?" Eddie looked at the boy, thinking of all the times he'd wondered if his life had left any mark at all. "Son, sometimes you don't get to pick how the world sees you. You just do your best, day after day. The rest, well, that's up to them. But you keep showing up. That's what matters." A silence passed between them, thick with meaning. The colonel clapped Eddie on the back, a gesture between equals. "I hope my son grows up with half your humility." Aaliyah, listening, smiled through tears. The day had started with uncertainty. Her fear that her grandfather would be humiliated or, worse, forgotten. But now she saw him as the center of a gathering that had finally, truly recognized its own heart. As families began to depart, a few lingered near Eddie, hoping to catch a final word or simply stand in his presence. The football coach approached, his usual bravado subdued. "Eddie, I owe you an apology. My guys make a mess after every practice, and you always cleaned it up with a smile. I never thanked you for that." Eddie shrugged, unbothered. "That's what I was here for." "But I appreciate it, Coach." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, faded photograph, a black and white shot of a young Eddie Harmon in uniform, flanked by two grinning comrades, all three smeared with grease and dust but full of life. He handed it to Aaliyah. "Your grandma took this, back before I shipped out. I always meant for you to have it when the time was right." Aaliyah held the photograph like a treasure. "Thank you, Grandpa. I'll never let anyone forget you. What you've done for all of us." The ceremony finally wound down. Decorations were packed up, the band faded away, and the gym began to empty. Eddie and his family were the last to leave, walking slowly out into the late afternoon sun. The air was soft and cool, heavy with the scent of cut grass and summer's approach. As they reached the parking lot, Eddie paused. He glanced back at Ridgepoint High, now just a building in the hush of early evening. "I guess it's true," he murmured. "Sometimes you have to be willing to stand in the shadows before you get your moment in the light." Aaliyah slipped her arm through his. "I'm proud of you, Grandpa. Today wasn't just my graduation. It was yours, too." Eddie squeezed her hand, his eyes shining. He looked at his daughter and son-in-law, at the families and veterans still chatting in the lot. And he realized that everything he'd ever given had found its way back to him in ways he'd never expected. In the stories people would tell, the photographs that would hang in homes, the new respect in every handshake, he had finally fully arrived. And as the sun slipped lower in the sky, Eddie Harmon smiled, ready to go home. Not as the man who cleaned the floors, but as the one who'd taught an entire town what it means to walk quietly among giants. Eddie Harmon thought the day's weight would lift as he left the gym, but he discovered that recognition, long denied, could feel as heavy as the silence it replaced. In the cool dusk outside Ridgepoint High, families milled about, lingering in the parking lot, reluctant to let the moment end. Cars beeped, seniors laughed, and parents called for group photos. Yet, everywhere Eddie turned, people greeted him with new eyes. Aaliyah held his arm as they made their way to the car. The challenge coin gleamed in his hand, still warm from the press of Colonel Ross's palm. Eddie turned it over, running a thumb along the engraving. For a moment, he was lost in memories of sand and sun and distant countries, of brothers in arms whose faces had faded with time, of promises made to men who never came home. He felt the old ache, sharp as a blade, but mingled now with something gentler, the balm of being seen, at last. Before Eddie could open the car door, a voice called out from behind. "Mr. Harmon?" He turned to find Miss Patel, the senior class advisor, hurrying over with a sheaf of papers clutched to her chest. She paused, catching her breath, then offered a nervous smile. I hope you'll forgive the staff for how things started today. None of us realized. Well, we didn't see you as we should have. Eddie shook his head, the lines at his eyes softening. We're all guilty of that sometimes, seeing only what's right in front of us. Miss Patel nodded, cheeks coloring. We're going to change that. I talked to Mr. Jennings and some of the board members. Next fall, we want to start a scholarship in your name, the Eddie Harmon Foundation, for students who work hard, serve quietly, don't get recognized. Would you be okay with that? The news knocked the air from Eddie's lungs. He'd spent a lifetime brushing aside accolades, but this? Something that would outlast him, something for the kids who were like he'd once been, felt different. That would mean a lot, Miss Patel, he said, voice gruff, more than I can say. Aaliyah squealed with delight, hugging her grandfather as Miss Patel hurried off to share the news with the other teachers. Around them, more students drifted over. Some Eddie recognized from the halls, a shy girl who'd always eaten lunch alone, a boy he'd once found crying near the bus ramp, a pair of siblings who'd spent afternoons waiting for a late parent. Each came with a story, a quiet thanks, a memory of a small kindness offered when no one else was watching. Mr. Harmon, you gave me a ride home once when my mom forgot me, the boy said, his eyes shining. You never told anyone. You just said, don't worry, buddy. Happens to the best of us. I never forgot that. Another, the shy girl, stepped forward, clutching a homemade thank you card. You used to leave flowers on the table in the library. I always thought it was magic, but now I know it was you. I kept every one. Eddie accepted the card, heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. You kids taught me as much as I ever taught you. I promise you that. The parking lot began to empty, families honking and waving as they pulled away, but a small crowd remained. A local pastor, Reverend Harris, approached Eddie with an invitation. We'd love for you to speak at Sunday service. The kids and the grown-ups need to hear about what real honor looks like. Eddie smiled but shook his head gently. I appreciate it, Reverend, but I think today was speech enough for me. The Reverend chuckled, understanding. Well, the door's always open if you change your mind. Aaliyah watched the exchange, feeling a deep sense of pride for her grandfather. She'd always admired him, but today had transformed that admiration into something much deeper, a fierce, protective love, and a desire to make sure his story was never lost again. They finally made their way home. The small house where Eddie had lived for decades felt brighter, almost sacred after the long, emotional day. Aaliyah's mother set out a special dinner: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, all Eddie's favorites. The family ate together, laughter bubbling up between bites as stories flowed, some old, some never told before. After dinner, Aaliyah pulled Eddie aside on the porch. The evening was soft, fireflies blinking along the hedges, cicadas singing in the trees. Grandpa, she began, her voice hesitant. Can I ask you something? Eddie nodded, his gaze steady. Why didn't you ever tell me about your medals? Or what you did in the war? Or how you saved that man? She paused, emotion making her voice tremble. I always knew you were special, but I didn't know how much. Eddie rocked slowly in his chair, looking out at the night. Some things are hard to talk about, baby. War's not just medals and parades. Sometimes it's what you have to carry, so others don't have to. And as for saving folks, sometimes you do what needs doing, and then you move on. Aaliyah leaned into his side. I'm glad you're my grandpa. I'm glad everyone knows now. He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Me too. But you remember something for me? All right? You don't need a uniform or a medal to make a difference. Just be kind. That's the hardest and bravest thing of all. They sat together, watching the stars emerge one by one. Inside, the news played, and Eddie's name appeared in the headlines. Local janitor, war hero, honored at graduation. Messages poured in from neighbors, old friends, even strangers moved by the story. But for Eddie, none of it compared to the warmth of his family, the gentle hush of a Carolina evening, and the knowledge that, finally, he was seen, not just for what he had done, but for who he had always been. Later, as he lay in bed, Eddie stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. The applause, the forgiveness, the promises of change. It was overwhelming, but healing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that his story would inspire, not for glory, but for goodness, humility, and the quiet courage that holds the world together. And somewhere, in the hush before sleep, he thought of all those who walked the same quiet path, unseen, unheralded, but essential. Eddie Harmon knew, deep in his bones, that their time to be noticed would come, just as his had, when the world was finally ready to see the quiet giants in its midst. The first rays of Sunday sun spilled through Eddie Harmon's curtains, painting streaks of gold across his bedroom floor. He lay awake, hands folded atop the faded quilt, staring up at the ceiling and replaying the events of graduation in his mind. The cheers, the challenge coin, the applause. These moments now lived in his bones, no longer a secret, no longer invisible. For the first time in decades, Eddie felt the world had not just looked at him, but truly seen him. The phone rang. Eddie shuffled out of bed, grinning at the thought that today, unlike any Sunday before, he didn't have to go in early to sweep the gym or mop the cafeteria. He picked up the phone, expecting a robocall, but Aaliyah's voice greeted him, warm and bright. "Morning, Grandpa? You up yet?" "Already had my coffee," he said, winking at the calendar on the wall. It was the kind of ordinary morning that felt miraculous after so much had changed. "We're coming over," she continued, excitement sparkling in her voice. "Mom says she's bringing pie." "Sounds like I better get out the good plates," Eddie replied, heart light. By late morning, his small house bustled with life. Aaliyah, her parents, and even Colonel Ross and his son dropped by, each carrying some token of appreciation: flowers, cards, homemade dishes. The kitchen table soon disappeared beneath a patchwork of casseroles and cakes, every dish offered as a symbol of thanks. Laughter echoed through the house, blending with the aroma of baking and the click of cameras, as neighbors stopped by to congratulate Eddie. Just after noon, there was a knock at the door. Reverend Harris stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes kind. "Afternoon, Eddie. Just wanted to drop off this," he said, holding out an envelope. It's an invitation to next month's community dinner. We'd be honored if you'd let us recognize you there." Eddie shook his head modestly, but the Reverend insisted. "You've done more for this town than most folks will ever know. It's time the town does something for you." Aaliyah grinned from behind her grandfather, nodding encouragement. "Say yes, Grandpa." Eddie finally relented. "All right, Reverend, but only if I get a seat in the back." That got a laugh from everyone within earshot. As afternoon light shifted to a soft amber, Eddie and Aaliyah found themselves alone on the porch, the sounds of celebration drifting from the kitchen behind them. Aaliyah, in her Sunday dress, fiddled with the military challenge coin, turning it over in her hands. "Grandpa, I've been thinking about what you said at graduation," she began quietly, "about kindness and how the world needs more people willing to do the quiet work." She bit her lip, eyes serious. "I want to help. I want to do something that matters." Eddie watched her for a long moment, pride swelling in his chest. "You already have, baby. You stood up when it counted. But if you want to do more, start with the folks right here." He nodded to the street, where neighbors swept sidewalks and kids raced bicycles. "Be the one who notices the ones nobody else does. That's where it starts." She nodded, determined. "I will." Inside, the TV flickered with a local news story. Footage from graduation played. Eddie on stage, Aaliyah's arms thrown around his neck, Colonel Ross saluting. The reporter's voiceover was clear. A story of sacrifice, humility, and the quiet power of kindness. Today, Ridge Point High and the whole town celebrates a real American hero. The phone rang again. This time it was a former student, now a teacher herself, calling from 3 states away. "Mr. Harmon, I saw you on the news. I tell my students about you all the time. You taught me that every person has a story." After that call, another and another. old Navy friends, community members, people who remembered a smile, a gentle word, a favor, given and never repaid. As sunset neared, Eddie finally slipped away from the crowd, drawn outside by the peace of dusk. The neighborhood felt changed, warmer, more aware. Neighbors nodded in greeting, some waving from their porches. The smallest gestures now seemed grand. A door held open, a child's thank you, an offer to carry groceries. At the corner, Eddie spotted the shy library girl from graduation, arms full of books. He called out, "Need a hand?" She blushed but accepted, and together they walked up the street, talking quietly about dreams and the power of believing in oneself. They passed the playground where Eddie had once fixed a broken swing after school hours. Now it was full of laughter, kids shouting his name, inviting him to watch their games. Eddie lingered for a while, trading stories and even pushing a swing or two, delighting in the simplicity of the moment. As darkness settled and stars pricked the sky, Aaliyah found her grandfather on the porch once more. She sat beside him, head on his shoulder, as they watched the moon rise. Neither spoke for a while. There was no need, everything important had already been said. Finally, Aaliyah broke the silence. "Do you ever regret anything, Grandpa?" He considered the question, rocking gently. "I regret not speaking up for myself sooner, sometimes, not letting people know who I was, what I'd done. But maybe I just needed the right moment and the right person to remind me I was never really invisible. Sometimes it's not about being seen by everyone. It's about being truly known by a few." Aaliyah smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm glad I know you, the real you." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "That's all I ever wanted." Inside, the family sang happy birthday to Eddie. Someone had remembered the day, though it wasn't actually his birthday, and everyone decided to celebrate anyway. There was cake and laughter and the soft sound of old records spinning on the player. The house, filled with the people Eddie had loved and cared for all his life, finally echoed with the recognition he had always deserved. The night ended with hugs, promises to visit, and one last look at the stars. Eddie felt the fullness of his life, the triumphs and the heartbreaks, the service and the silence, the hard work and the unexpected glory. In that quiet, infinite moment, Eddie Harmon knew this was the true reward, not medals or applause, but the enduring bonds of love, kindness, and respect. The knowledge that, at last, his story, like so many quiet stories before him, had found its voice. And as sleep crept in, Eddie dreamed not of battles or regrets, but of new days filled with hope, family, and the legacy of humble greatness that would live on in every heart he'd touched. The weeks following graduation passed in a blur for Eddie Harmon and his family. What started as a simple day meant for students and parents had blossomed into something much larger, a story that reached far beyond Ridgepoint High's gym. The ripple effect was everywhere, from the smallest gesture on the street to the wider world that now knew Eddie's name. Eddie's days changed. Each morning, instead of his old routine, mopping the cafeteria, polishing trophy cases in silence, he was greeted with waves and smiles from people he'd known for years and others he'd only just met. Children stopped him in the grocery store to shake his hand, parents nodded respectfully from their cars, and the local VFW invited him for coffee and long talks about service, brotherhood, and sacrifice. But there was one gesture that stood above the rest. A week after graduation, Colonel Ross returned to Eddie's home, this time with a small velvet box in his hand and an air of solemnity. Mr. Harmon," he began as he stood on the porch, "the Army and the Navy don't always cross paths, but honor is honor. I spoke with the commander of my brother's old unit. He sent this as a token of our gratitude." He opened the box to reveal a medal, a silver star set against a field of deep blue, the words "For Valor" engraved around the edge. It's not an official decoration," the colonel explained, "but it's from those who know what you did, who never forgot. You saved a life. You saved a family that deserves more than a thank you. Eddie's hands shook as he accepted the box. For a moment, old wounds and old pride threatened to overwhelm him, but he steadied himself with a breath. Thank you, Colonel. I didn't do it for medals, but I'll treasure this all the same. News of the presentation quickly made its way around town. The local paper ran a front-page feature, A Lifetime of Quiet Valor, The Man Who Cleaned Ridgepoint High. It included interviews with former students, teachers, and even janitorial staff from other schools who spoke of Eddie's kindness, how he never failed to lend a hand or a listening ear, how he always had a joke or a bit of encouragement for anyone having a rough day. Aaliyah, meanwhile, worked alongside Miss Patel and the school board to finalize the Eddie Harmon Foundation. Flyers went up around town announcing that the first scholarship would be awarded at the next year's graduation. For quiet service and unseen sacrifice, the foundation became a rallying point for students who might otherwise go unrecognized, the library assistants, the volunteers, the ones who stayed late to help, just as Eddie always had. One afternoon, as summer heat settled over Charlotte, Aaliyah joined Eddie on his porch. She carried a notebook brimming with ideas. I want to tell your story everywhere, she said, excited and earnest. Not just in the school, but to anyone who will listen. I think people need to hear it. Eddie smiled, warmed by her ambition. Just be sure you listen to other stories, too. There are a lot of folks out there like me, folks who keep the world turning and never ask for anything in return. Aaliyah nodded. That's the plan, Grandpa. We'll make sure they're seen. In the days that followed, Eddie found himself pulled in many directions. The pastor from the local church stopped by, asking again if he'd speak at a community supper. The town council invited him to attend a city meeting as their guest of honor. The school board arranged for a portrait to be hung in the Ridgepoint hallway. A photograph of Eddie in his work jacket and navy cap, eyes full of wisdom, flanked by a simple inscription: to those who serve without asking to be seen. Through it all, Eddie remained humble. He often deflected praise, shifting the attention to others. I was just one man, he would say. There are dozens, hundreds, just like me. Don't forget them. The kids didn't. Inspired by the story, Ridgepoint's student government started Kindness Day. Once a month, students, teachers, and staff recognized someone in the school who made a difference behind the scenes. The cafeteria worker who learned every student's favorite meal, the bus driver who drove carefully on icy mornings, the custodian who stayed late to help fix a broken science project. Eddie was always there, smiling, encouraging the next person to step into the light. One evening, as thunder rolled in the distance and the scent of summer rain drifted through the open windows, Eddie sat at the kitchen table with his daughter and Aaliyah. They shared a simple dinner, laughter softening the edges of the long day. Do you ever wish things had gone differently? His daughter asked, curiosity and concern in her eyes. Eddie paused. Sometimes I wish I'd spoken up sooner. Maybe I wouldn't have spent so many years invisible. But if I had, maybe I wouldn't have learned how much a small kindness matters. Maybe I wouldn't have met the people I did, helped the way I could. He looked at Aaliyah, voice gentle. You can't always control when the world wakes up and sees you. All you can do is keep being yourself. Do what's right, even if no one's watching. Outside, the rain began, tapping softly on the roof. The family fell silent, listening. Eddie closed his eyes, letting the sound settle him. In that piece, he realized that recognition wasn't about the applause or the awards. It was about being remembered by those who mattered, about knowing he'd made a difference. The next day, as Eddie walked downtown, he was greeted by people of every age and background. Some called him a hero. Some just nodded in respect. Eddie returned every greeting, sometimes pausing to listen to a stranger's story or offer a word of encouragement. Each interaction was a new thread, weaving him deeper into the fabric of his community. As summer deepened, Eddie continued to serve, not as a janitor anymore, but as a symbol. He volunteered at the food bank, helped organize neighborhood cleanups, and mentored young veterans struggling to find their place after service. His house became a gathering place where people came to talk, laugh, or just sit on the porch and watch the world go by. The story of Master Sergeant Eddie Harmon, once nearly erased by time and routine, had become a legend that would outlast him. Ridgepoint High and the town beyond would never see a janitor the same way again. And as evening fell, Eddie sat once more beneath the porch light, content. He'd walked quietly all his life, but now every step left an echo, a reminder to look past the surface, to honor those who serve in silence, and to never, ever take kindness for granted. The sun had set on another summer day in Charlotte, and the soft hum of crickets filled the twilight outside Eddie Harmon's house. Inside, a warm yellow glow spilled through the windows, illuminating family photos and mementos of a life quietly lived. The challenge coin from Colonel Ross sat in a place of honor beside the new For Valor medal, their gleam reflecting the love and pride now woven into Eddie's days. It had been a few months since the graduation ceremony that changed everything, but its echo still lingered in Ridgepoint. The town had found new heroes in its midst, not just Eddie, but every lunch lady, bus driver, janitor, and crossing guard who'd ever labored in the background, unseen, but essential. Eddie's story had opened everyone's eyes, and the change was both subtle and profound. The Eddie Harmon Foundation was more than a scholarship now. It had become a movement. Students and parents nominated everyday heroes each month, telling stories of kindness, perseverance, and humility. Hallways buzzed with a new kind of energy. Students volunteered more, teachers recognized the quiet contributors, and acts of service, once taken for granted, were now honored and celebrated. Aaliyah, now preparing for her first year at college, threw herself into expanding the foundation. She led workshops on empathy and service, encouraging her classmates to notice those who were too often ignored. Every time she spoke, she credited her grandfather. "I am who I am because of the man who taught me to see others clearly, to treat everyone with respect, no matter their job or their silence." Eddie, meanwhile, found himself the heart of a growing community, and neighbors brought pies. Veterans stopped by to swap stories, and kids from Ridgepoint High dropped in for advice or a safe place to sit after school. His porch became a gathering spot, a place where no one felt small or forgotten. Yet, despite the newfound attention, Eddie never let pride replace humility. He still swept his own walk every morning, waved to the mailman, and helped fix a broken fence for the family down the street. He insisted on attending every scholarship award ceremony, shaking the hand of each recipient and reminding them, "What you do for others matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." The story of Ridgepoint's janitor hero even caught the attention of a national news outlet, which sent a reporter to do a feature. The crew arrived with cameras and microphones, but Eddie treated them like old friends, offering lemonade and inviting them to sit on the porch swing. When asked how it felt to be called a hero, he shook his head and smiled. "I just tried to do right by folks," he said. "Maybe if we all did a little more of that, the world would be a better place." The segment aired on a Sunday night, and within days, letters poured in from across the country. Veterans, school custodians, and strangers wrote to thank Eddie for reminding them that their stories mattered too. Some included photos, others shared memories of their own quiet heroes. Eddie read every letter, keeping a box of them by his chair, a testament to how far a ripple of kindness could reach. But for Eddie, the most meaningful moments were still those spent with his family. On the eve of Aaliyah's departure for college, the family gathered for a farewell dinner. The table overflowed with food, laughter, and stories. Some retold for the 100th time, others new, each one another thread binding them closer. After dinner, Aaliyah lingered beside her grandfather on the porch. The air was thick with cicada song, the moon hanging low and gold over the rooftops. I'm nervous, Grandpa," she confessed, voice quiet. "What if I'm not ready for what's next?" Eddie squeezed her hand, his own strong and steady despite the years. "You're more ready than you know. The world's big and noisy, but you've got a good heart. That's what will carry you through." She nodded, fighting back tears. "Promise me you'll come visit?" He smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Nothing could keep me away." The next morning, as they loaded the car for the drive to campus, Eddie handed Aaliyah the faded photograph he'd once shown her. A young man in Navy uniform, standing tall with his friends. "Keep this with you," he said. A reminder that even the smallest actions echo through generations. And whenever you doubt yourself, remember, greatness isn't about being seen. It's about showing up, doing your part, and lifting others when you can. Aaliyah hugged him tightly. "I love you, Grandpa. Love you too, baby. Now go change the world." That day, as the car disappeared down the street, Eddie stood waving at the curb long after they'd turned the corner. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. A peacefulness rooted in belonging and respect. Life returned to its steady rhythm. Eddie spent his mornings volunteering at the food pantry, afternoons mentoring local kids, and evenings on the porch reflecting on all that had come to pass. Sometimes strangers would stop to shake his hand or thank him. Sometimes it was just the breeze and the memory of a gym filled with applause. He never stopped being the man who saw others. He never stopped listening for the unspoken needs around him. The town had changed, but so had Eddie. He had learned, finally, to let his own story be part of the fabric of Ridgepoint, woven into the hearts of all who had come to know him. On the anniversary of that unforgettable graduation, the school held a ceremony in the gym. Banners hung from the rafters, the same indigo and gold, but now one of them bore Eddie's name. This time, he walked in as an honored guest, greeted by cheers and a sea of grateful faces. The principal, no longer reading from prepared notes, invited Eddie to say a few words to the new class. He approached the podium, challenge coin in his pocket, granddaughter smiling in the front row. Eddie looked out at the gathered students, teachers, and families, at all those bright young faces waiting for the next chapter of their lives. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady and true. "You might not always get recognized for what you do. People might not see your hard work, or your kindness, or the battles you fight when no one's looking, but you matter, every one of you. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the world will stop and notice. When that happens, accept it with grace, and keep lifting others the way you were lifted." He finished simply, but his words landed like a stone in still water, sending out ripples of inspiration that would last long after the applause faded. As the ceremony ended and families gathered for photos, Eddie watched from the edge of the gym, smiling, proud, and at peace. He had lived a life of quiet service, and now his story belonged to everyone. He didn't ask to be seen. He just came to watch his granddaughter shine. But in doing so, he reminded everyone what real honor looks like. Don't judge someone by their job title, their jacket, or their silence. Some of the greatest warriors walk among us, humble and unseen. If this story moved you, show your respect. Like the video, share it, and follow for more real stories of true American heroes.